The year was 1944, and the skies over Germany were changing. Beneath a heavy, leaden sky, the once mighty Luftwaffe squadrons roared into the horizon, their engines echoing like the last cries of a dying beast. Smoke curled from bombed-out factories and shattered cities, and the acrid stench of burning oil and iron filled the air. Pilots gripped their controls with trembling hands, nerves frayed, knowing each mission might be their last. Below, civilians scurried through ruined streets, windows shattered from Allied air raids, as the once pristine towns now lay in gray ruin. The distant thunder of approaching bombers rolled over the hills, a reminder that Germany's air superiority was slipping. The men of the Luftwaffe, once confident in their dominance, now faced a relentless enemy, the Allies' tactical genius, superior numbers, and devastating new technologies. Among them, a few daring pilots prepared to fly the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, a marvel of speed and firepower. Yet brilliance alone could not overcome the strategic blunders that had begun to cripple the Luftwaffe: delayed production, mismanagement, and Hitler's stubborn insistence on using the jet as a bomber instead of a fighter. Each takeoff was a calculated gamble, with death lurking in every shadow of the sky. And there it was, the first jet ascending into the gray heavens, leaving a streak of silver against the smoke-choked horizon. A harbinger of Germany's fading aerial might. On a bitter November morning, the first Me-262s rolled onto the runway at Lechfeld Air Base, their sleek silver fuselages catching the dim, gray light of a winter dawn. The air was thick with frost, biting at the exposed skin of the ground crew and pilots alike, turning breath into tiny clouds that hovered like ghosts over the muddy tarmac. Every surface was slick with a mixture of oil, melted frost, and the remnants of last night's rain, glinting under the weak sun like a hazardous mirror. The sound of boots crunching on gravel mixed with the low hum of jet engines idling, a vibration that seemed to penetrate the bones of anyone standing too close. It was unlike the throaty roar of a piston engine. The Me-262's turbojet emitted a high-pitched whine that rose and fell in almost musical cadence, but with a piercing intensity that could make the ears ache if one lingered too long beside it. The hum seemed to whisper of speed and destruction, a promise of power, yet tinged with foreboding. Pilots approached the aircraft with measured steps, their faces a mixture of awe and anxiety. They ran gloved hands over polished metal, checking seams, brushing off droplets of condensation, and peering through windshields misted by the cold. They were veterans of the Luftwaffe, men who had flown countless missions in the familiar Messerschmitts and Foch Wolfs, yet the Me-262 was an entirely different beast. Its cockpit felt smaller, more enclosed, the controls sensitive and precise. Every dial, every switch seemed to hum with latent energy. Waiting for the moment of ignition, the pilots ran through mental checklists, reciting them aloud to themselves and to one another in hushed, clipped German, the words carrying more weight because of what they implied: success, survival, death, or failure. Some of the younger pilots trembled slightly, hands gripping flight helmets, as if the leather could steady their resolve. They could feel the vibration of the engines through the soles of their boots, a subtle yet constant reminder that this was no ordinary aircraft. It was the future of aerial warfare, and yet also a fragile instrument in a war that was beginning to slip from Germany's grasp. Around the base, ground crews scurried like ants, moving with both urgency and precision. Mechanics wiped tools clean with greasy rags, their movements deliberate to avoid contaminating the sensitive jet engines. Fuel trucks hissed as they pumped volatile kerosene into the aircraft tanks, releasing fumes that mingled with the cold morning air to create a haze that made the edges of the runway blur into the surrounding trees and hangars. The smell of fuel and hot metal burned at the nostrils, a harsh perfume of industry and destruction. Sparks occasionally flew from contact points, tiny orange flashes that disappeared into the gray mist, but each one seemed a visual echo of the danger inherent in these machines. The ground crews exchanged nods and shouted short commands, their voices snapping sharply through the hum of the engines. But even as they moved with practiced rhythm, there was a pervasive tension in their shoulders, a collective awareness that any misstep could be catastrophic. The Luftwaffe commanders observed from the tower, dark figures behind paned windows streaked with condensation and soot. Their faces were carved with lines of worry and impatience, their eyes scanning the runway, as if willing the pilots and jets to perform flawlessly. These commanders had grown up in an era where German air power was feared across Europe, but now, faced with the Allies' overwhelming industrial capacity and the relentless march of new technologies, they could only watch and hope. They whispered to one another in low tones, the weight of responsibility pressing on their chests. Every order they gave seemed both urgent and inadequate, hampered by a bureaucracy that had slowed in its reaction to the rapidly changing face of war. The irony was bitter. They held in their hands an aircraft capable of unmatched speed and lethality, yet the mismanagement and strategic errors that had plagued the Luftwaffe since the war's beginning meant that even the Mi-262 might not be enough to turn the tide. As the first jets taxied down the runway, the sound of their engines grew louder, a keening, high-frequency wail that reverberated against the concrete and steel of the hangars. Pilots felt the vibrations through the seats and rudder pedals, every rumble and shudder a reminder of both the power and the unpredictability of these revolutionary machines. The takeoff roll was unlike anything they had experienced before. The aircraft accelerated with a force that pressed them into their harnesses, a sensation both exhilarating and terrifying. The runway beneath them blurred, snow-dusted grass edges streaking past as the Mi-262 lifted into the gray morning sky. The air above the base seemed to vibrate with the energy of flight, charged with anticipation and dread. In the sky, clouds hung low and heavy, a shifting gray ceiling that threatened to conceal the enemy and magnify the dangers of flight. As the jets ascended, they cut through the mist with razor-sharp precision, the whine of their engines slicing through the quiet dawn. Pilots scanned the horizon obsessively, eyes straining against the dim light, looking for the approaching silhouettes of Allied bombers. Their hearts pounded in their chests, a metronome of fear and adrenaline. Every instinct honed over years of aerial combat screamed to anticipate, to react, to survive. But the Mi-262 demanded something new: adaptability, split-second decision-making, and complete trust in the machine beneath them. Below, the base seemed almost surreal, a tableau of human industry and anxiety frozen under the weight of winter light. Mechanics leaned against vehicles, rubbing frostbitten hands together, while officers shouted orders over the roar of engines, their words competing with the sheer intensity of sound that filled the air. Small details seemed magnified in the quiet tension, the steam rising from engine vents, the glint of sunlight on metal rivets, the black smoke curling from the chimneys of distant factories, and the distant murmur of towns already scarred by war. Every element reinforced the sense that the Luftwaffe was entering a new era of warfare, one that demanded mastery of not just skill and courage, but also technology itself. The first sorties launched into the heavy, clouded sky, jets slicing through the fog with remarkable speed. The sensation of acceleration pressed the pilots into their seats, the wind screaming past the canopy, carrying with it the distant echoes of anti-aircraft fire from earlier engagements. Pilots felt their stomachs lurch with every maneuver, every climb, and bank a delicate balance of control and risk. They could smell the sharp tang of burning kerosene as the engines roared, mingling with the cold, damp scent of the clouds they pierced. The aircraft responded almost telepathically to the slightest adjustments, the pilots' fingers dancing across throttles and yokes with precision born of fear, training, and necessity. Even as they climbed, the pilots could see the distant forms of bombers approaching like looming shadows. The Mi-262's speed allowed them to close the distance rapidly, yet even with such technological superiority, the pilots were painfully aware of the limitations imposed by mismanagement, delayed orders, and mechanical fragility. Each pilot knew that one mistake, misjudging altitude, throttle, or trajectory, could be fatal. Their focus narrowed, senses heightened to an almost unbearable degree, every sound and movement amplified. In that moment, the sky became a crucible, testing the mettle of men, machines, and strategy alike. By the time the jets reached altitude, the weight of anticipation pressed on everyone involved. Ground crews craned their necks, watching the aircraft disappear into the gray ceiling, eyes following contrails that seemed impossibly fast. Commanders in the tower exchanged grim looks, acknowledging silently the duality of hope and fear. The Mi-262 was a marvel, yes, capable of unparalleled performance, but in the theater of war, it was not invincible. Speed could not compensate for confusion, indecision, or the human element that still governed life and death in the skies. The first flight, exhilarating and tense, was a microcosm of the Luftwaffe's predicament: brilliance undermined by circumstance, potential hamstrung by error, and a war slipping inevitably toward defeat. Above, the Mi-262 jet streaked through the gray morning, sunlight glinting off metallic surfaces as contrails sliced through the mist. The engine's whine, once a hum, now a crescendo, reverberated across the base and surrounding hills. It was a sound that would echo in memory long after the war, an emblem of speed, power, hope, and hubris. And yet, amid all this promise and peril, there was a shadow hanging over every pilot, mechanic, and officer, the awareness that history had not paused, that the enemy adapted, and that even the most revolutionary technology could not save a force whose strategy, production, and leadership had begun to crumble. As the Mi-2062s clawed through the gray, cloud-choked sky, the initial exhilaration of their pilots began to give way to the harsh realities of combat. The turbojet engines, capable of speeds previously unimaginable, allowed the jets to overtake Allied bombers with astonishing ease, yet the technological advantage was not absolute. Each ascent into the heavens exposed vulnerabilities, both mechanical and strategic, that could turn a moment of triumph into a catastrophe. Pilots, even those seasoned by countless sorties and conventional fighters, found themselves navigating a radically new theater of aerial warfare. Every climb, dive, and sharp bank demanded absolute focus. Even the slightest miscalculation in throttle or angle could send the aircraft into a deadly spin. They could feel the engines straining under rapid acceleration, and the acrid smell of kerosene mixed with burnt oil often filled the cockpit during high-speed maneuvers, a constant reminder of the delicate balance between power and destruction. The skies were far from empty. Dark, ominous silhouettes of Allied bombers moved in methodical formations below the clouds, their propellers slicing the air with steady rhythm. Each bomber was accompanied by fighter escorts, hawk-like P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts patrolling in precise arcs, ready to intercept any threat. The Mi-262s could outpace most conventional fighters in straight-line flight, but when it came to tactical positioning, numbers mattered. Pilots quickly realized that speed alone was insufficient when faced with coordinated opposition. The jet could streak past a bomber, unleash a burst of fire from its cannons, and escape with ease. Yet multiple interceptors could corner even the fastest aircraft if pilots were forced into prolonged engagements. It became a deadly calculus where seconds could determine life or death, and every maneuver had to be weighed against the strategic intelligence, or lack thereof, provided from above. One of the most frustrating limitations of the Mi-262 was its reliance on meticulous preparation and maintenance. The jet's turbojets were marvels of engineering, but they were temperamental, vulnerable to overheating, and intolerant of mishandling. Mechanics worked tirelessly, their fingers coated in grease and soot, checking turbines and fuel lines, cleaning delicate injectors, and replacing components with painstaking precision. Any lapse in care could mean an engine failure mid-flight, and such failures were often fatal. During missions, pilots became acutely aware of these risks. A sudden sputter or unexpected surge in engine RPM could send adrenaline spiking, forcing them to make split-second decisions under extreme duress. The constant hum of the jet was accompanied by an undercurrent of anxiety, a tension that never fully abated. The mechanical fragility of the aircraft meant that every sortie was not only a test of skill but also of trust. In themselves, in their machines, and in the ground crews who maintained them. Above the clouds, the air was alive with danger. Allied formations were expertly coordinated, and as the Mi-2062s approached, the fighters engaged in agile, high-speed maneuvers designed to counteract the jet's superior velocity. Pilots felt a jolt of fear when tracer rounds hissed past, slicing through the mist, and the smell of spent gunpowder and smoke occasionally drifted upward, carried by air currents. The sky seemed to vibrate with tension, each engagement a mixture of chaos and precision, where every decision could tilt the balance toward survival or disaster. The pilot's training was pushed to the limits. Instincts honed over years of war were both invaluable and occasionally misleading, as the Mi-262's unprecedented speed altered the dynamics of aerial combat. Timing was everything. A misjudged approach could leave a pilot vulnerable to multiple attackers, while hesitation might squander the fleeting advantage of a clear line of fire on a bomber. Commanders on the ground were equally aware of the fragility of the situation. They monitored communications with a mixture of hope and dread, listening to clipped reports of engagement outcomes, mechanical issues, and enemy positions. Orders were often delayed or unclear, reflecting the inefficiencies and mismanagement that had plagued the Luftwaffe throughout the war. Pilots, forced to interpret directives in real time, frequently had to make tactical decisions on the fly without the benefit of coordinated support. The combination of advanced technology, limited resources, and fractured leadership created a scenario in which brilliance alone could not prevail. Each sortie became an intricate, high-stakes ballet of speed, firepower, and human judgment, where the margin for error was vanishingly small. The psychological toll on pilots was immense. With every encounter, fear and adrenaline surged in alternating waves. Pilots could feel their hearts hammering in their chests as they dived toward bomber formations, cannon fire streaking past like deadly ribbons of light. The whine of the engines and the roar of air rushing past the fuselage formed an almost deafening soundtrack, punctuated by the staccato explosions of anti-aircraft flak below. Their senses were acutely tuned to every vibration, every change in pressure, every shadow that hinted at an approaching enemy fighter. Some pilots closed their eyes briefly, relying on muscle memory and instinct honed over hundreds of missions. But even this brief respite carried risk. In the wrong moment, it could mean collision or death. The mental strain was compounded by the knowledge that every loss weakened the Luftwaffe's already diminished effectiveness, making each decision both personal and strategic. On the ground, the chaos mirrored the tension in the sky. Mechanics scrambled to respond to reports of malfunctions mid-flight, fueling stations worked frantically to keep jets operational, and officers attempted to coordinate sorties with limited intelligence. Runways became scenes of controlled chaos, with jets taxiing alongside trucks, crates of ammunition, and crews signaling urgent instructions. The smell of fuel, burnt oil, and frost mingled with the acrid smoke of nearby explosions, creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously industrial and apocalyptic. Even the faintest lapse in focus could result in catastrophe: a misaligned wing, a loose fuel cap, a single spark near volatile kerosene. Each was a potential death sentence. The logistical challenges of sustaining jet operations were staggering. Spare parts were scarce due to Allied bombing of production facilities, and every component was critical. Pilots sometimes waited weeks for replacement engines, turbine blades, or specialized instruments, grounding some aircraft indefinitely. The Luftwaffe's decision to prioritize bomber missions over defensive interception further strained resources, leaving pilots frustrated and vulnerable. Many missions were launched with jets only partially operational, with engines prone to overheating and instruments that occasionally failed under extreme conditions. In the midst of such vulnerability, pilots were forced to confront the reality that their speed and firepower were not always enough. Survival depended as much on ingenuity and caution as it did on the aircraft's revolutionary capabilities. Despite the challenges, pilots continued to engage the enemy with fierce determination. They streaked through clouds, closing the distance to bombers in seconds, unleashing the Mi-2062's 30 Mi cannons with precision. The concussive force of the firing reverberated through the cockpit, shaking the aircraft and forcing the pilot to maintain unwavering control. Shell casings ejected, glinting in the sunlight that occasionally pierced the overcast sky, and distant explosions marked successful hits or the destruction of a bomber's wing. Even victories were tempered by the awareness that one mistake, one mechanical failure, one missed calculation, could undo everything in an instant. Each kill was a fleeting triumph in a war that was already being lost, a reminder that the Mi-262, as revolutionary as it was, could not rectify the fundamental strategic failures of the Luftwaffe. As sorties continued, fatigue began to set in. Pilots endured long hours in cramped, cold cockpits, muscles stiffening from the strain of constant maneuvering. Eyes burned from focus, fingers cramped from controlling the sensitive throttles, and minds teetered on the edge of exhaustion. Yet the pace of the war allowed no respite. The constant pressure to intercept bombers, protect cities, and maintain operational readiness meant that even the briefest moment of inattention could result in disaster. Pilots developed a grim camaraderie, communicating through hand signals, clipped radio transmissions, and silent gestures, forming bonds forged in the shared crucible of speed, firepower, and vulnerability. Even as some missions achieved tactical successes, the strategic picture remained grim. Allied forces adapted rapidly, employing new formations, tactics, and technologies that diminished the Mi-262's effectiveness. Radar tracking, coordinated fighter sweeps, and overwhelming numerical superiority ensured that no jet, regardless of its capabilities, could secure long-term dominance. The Luftwaffe's strategic errors, delayed deployment, poor allocation of resources, and mismanagement of aircraft production compounded the problem, rendering each victory momentary and each sortie a precarious gamble. The sky, once the domain of German supremacy, had become a battlefield defined by uncertainty, innovation, and relentless danger. By the time the jets returned to base, pilots were physically and mentally drained. Yet they were also acutely aware of the delicate balance between life and death that had defined every second above the clouds. Some aircraft bore damage from near misses or minor mechanical failures, engines smoldering, fuselages pocked with shrapnel, yet still they had returned, a testament to both pilot skill and the resilience of the Mi-262. Ground crews worked feverishly to prepare the jets for the next sortie, their movements precise despite exhaustion, knowing that every delay could be fatal for the pilots who would soon climb back into the cockpits. In that moment, the Mi-262s became more than machines. They were symbols of technological brilliance entwined with human vulnerability, innovation shackled by mismanagement, and hope tempered by the relentless pressures of war. Pilots, mechanics, and commanders alike understood that each mission was a fragile interplay of skill, speed, and circumstance. The jets could outpace enemies, strike with devastating firepower, and inspire awe, but they could not overcome the mistakes, shortages, and inefficiencies that had begun to doom the Luftwaffe. Each flight into the gray, clouded sky was a high-stakes exercise in courage, precision, and survival, a fleeting assertion of dominance in a war that was increasingly slipping beyond their control. By spring 1945, the Luftwaffe had been reduced to a shadow of its former self, its once mighty wings clipped by a combination of relentless Allied pressure, strategic miscalculations, and the very brilliance of the Mi-262 jets that were meant to secure its supremacy. The skies over Germany were no longer a domain dominated by swastikas. They were crowded with Allied aircraft that patrolled with systematic precision, hunting the remnants of the German Air Force like predators circling a wounded prey. Every sortie launched by the Mi-262s was a desperate act, a gamble in a war that had long since slipped beyond Germany's grasp. Pilots climbed into their cockpits with a sense of fatalism, aware that the machines beneath them, as revolutionary as they were, could not compensate for the strategic chaos that had engulfed the Luftwaffe. Each takeoff carried a mix of exhilaration, fear, and the haunting knowledge that for many, this might be their final flight. The Mi-262, still unmatched in speed, now appeared almost like a relic of lost opportunity. Its sleek metallic fuselage, gleaming under the weak spring sun, streaked across gray skies as if mocking the failures on the ground. Pilots, though skilled and courageous, were often forced to operate without coordination, taking to the skies with little intelligence about enemy formations or the whereabouts of fellow jets. Allied forces had anticipated the capabilities of the Mi-262, developing countermeasures, tactics, and overwhelming numerical superiority that rendered the jet's advantages temporary and fragile. Each interception mission was a perilous dance, with pilots weaving through clouds, diving toward bombers, and banking sharply to evade escort fighters. The hum of turbojets, once a sound of empowerment, now carried an undercurrent of desperation, a sonic reminder of brilliance outpaced by circumstance. Below, German cities were collapsing under the weight of sustained Allied bombing campaigns. Smoke rose from flattened neighborhoods, mingling with the haze of industry and the scent of burning buildings. Streets were littered with debris, the remnants of shattered lives, as civilians moved cautiously, seeking shelter among ruins that had once been homes, markets, and factories. On the outskirts of airbases, hangars lay in varying states of disrepair. Some were completely gutted, roofs torn open by bombs, metal frames twisted and blackened. Others housed jets that had returned with battle damage, their fuselages pocked with holes from flak and tracer fire. Pilots climbed from cockpits, faces streaked with soot and sweat, their bodies trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion, as mechanics and ground crews worked frantically to patch engines, refill fuel tanks, and prepare for the next sortie. Every motion was urgent yet calculated. There was no margin for error, no luxury for hesitation. The human toll of these final missions was immense. Pilots who had once soared with confidence now moved with a haunted determination, their eyes reflecting the accumulated weight of loss, fear, and the grim recognition of futility. Each successful sortie was shadowed by the memory of comrades who had failed to return, aircraft destroyed mid-flight by mechanical failure, enemy fire, or miscalculated maneuvers. The camaraderie forged in countless missions was tinged with grief. Conversations were clipped, gestures brief, yet there was a silent acknowledgement of shared struggle, a bond forged in the relentless crucible of aerial combat. Ground crews, too, bore the burden of exhaustion and anxiety. They worked in bitter wind and rain, grace and soot smearing their hands, lungs filled with fumes of fuel and smoke, knowing that their efforts might not be enough to save the men they supported. As the war drew toward its final days, strategic mistakes became painfully evident. Hitler's insistence on using the Mi-262 as a bomber rather than an interceptor had squandered the jet's potential to defend German airspace. Factories were mismanaged, production delayed, and spare parts were often unavailable when urgently needed. Pilots and engineers alike recognized the tragic irony. The very aircraft designed to restore German air dominance had been misused, mismanaged, and deployed in ways that undermined its revolutionary capabilities. Each mission was a stark illustration of opportunity lost, of technological genius overshadowed by bureaucratic ineptitude and hubris. Even the fastest jets, the most skilled pilots, and the most innovative designs could not compensate for systemic failure. Allied air superiority became increasingly absolute. Squadrons of bombers and fighters swarmed over Germany, their formation patterns precise and methodical, their numerical advantage overwhelming. Mi-2062s, though capable of unmatched speed, could no longer dominate the skies unchallenged. They intercepted bombers and engaged fighters, but the engagements were increasingly desperate and often futile. Explosions punctuated the gray sky as flak shredded aircraft. Tracer rounds streaked through clouds, and the sharp crack of cannon fire echoed over fields and towns below. Pilots became acutely aware that survival depended as much on luck as on skill. Every maneuver, every evasive dive was a calculated risk. One misjudged angle, one moment too late, and the aircraft and pilot could be lost in the vast expanse of sky. On the ground, the consequences of aerial failure were starkly visible. Cities burned, infrastructure crumbled, and morale sank to unprecedented lows. The once proud bases of the Luftwaffe were emptied of aircraft, hangars stripped, and runways scarred with craters. Commanders struggled to coordinate the remaining sorties, issuing orders through broken communications, often too late to make a difference. Pilots returning from missions were debriefed in tense, hurried sessions, reports scribbled in haste, often incomplete or inaccurate. The war had become a relentless cycle of action and reaction, where even the most advanced technology was rendered partially impotent by exhaustion, mismanagement, and overwhelming enemy superiority. Amid this chaos, the Mi-2062s remained symbols of both hope and futility. They streaked across the horizon, silver streaks against gray clouds, capable of unmatched speed and lethality, yet their presence highlighted the failures that had led to the Luftwaffe's collapse. Pilots who survived each sortie returned with grim expressions, faces lined with soot and fatigue, eyes reflecting the weight of accumulated loss. They walked among twisted wreckage, stepping carefully over shards of metal, spent shell casings, and burned fuel, acutely aware that every object on the ground was a reminder of what had been lost. Planes, comrades, cities, and the illusion of invincibility that had once defined the Luftwaffe. The final missions became exercises in survival as much as strategy. Pilots relied on instinct. Above the ruins, the sky became a silent witness to the death of the Luftwaffe. Allied fighters patrolled relentlessly, their engines a constant hum of inevitability. Mi-2062s streaked briefly across the horizon, flashes of silver that signaled courage and desperation, brilliance and futility intertwined. Pilots clung to life with every fiber of their being, executing maneuvers that tested the limits of their bodies and machines. Below, cities smoldered, bases lay in ruins, and the remnants of the Luftwaffe shuffled through the detritus of what had once been an empire of the skies. The war ended not with a grand battle, but with the quiet extinguishing of capability, hope, and morale. The Mi-2062s, though unmatched in their era, could not compensate for lost time, mismanaged resources, and a command structure that had failed to harness their potential. Pilots who survived the final flights walked through battered bases, their eyes scanning the horizon, reflecting the futility of what they had fought for. Ground crews collected the remnants of shattered aircraft, their hands stained with oil and sweat, aware that even their tireless efforts could not alter the course of history. And so, the Luftwaffe, once feared and dominant, became a cautionary tale, a force undone by a combination of human error, hubris, and the relentless advance of a better, prepared enemy. The Mi-2062 jets streaked across the skies one last time, beautiful, lethal, and tragic, embodying both the genius and the failure of Nazi Germany's final months. Their roar faded into memory, leaving behind ruins, ash, and the indelible mark of a military force that had flown too high, too fast, and too recklessly to survive.